Everything should be kept as simple as possible. But don't make it any simpler than that. Stay. This book is an empirical study of how people say yes. Why does a proposition that was rejected yesterday suddenly gain weight today just by changing a few words? Why the recurring motif of a small gift? A missed public consensus, a crowd's laughter, a white blouse or a countdown clock are enough to move us like well-placed levers. I approached the subject through two parallel routes: controlled experiments in the lab and intentional immersion into the worlds of people who make a living by influence, from sales, fundraising, advertising to recruiting, to observe the techniques at work in everyday life. From there, 6 prominent principles emerge as weapons of influence: reward, commitment and consistency, social proof, love of authority, scarcity. What they have in common is the ability to trigger automatic responses that are effective in most situations, but also a gateway to manipulation if we don't recognize and put them in the proper context. So if most decisions are made in a state of information overload, the real question is not how to be immune to influence, but when to let our psychological shortcuts work for us and when to stop and reclaim control in that seemingly harmless moment between a click and the tape starting to play. Before we get to the summary, we encourage listeners to buy and read the book to fully appreciate its content. Because only when you read this book will you understand the issues you are hearing me talk about. Please buy the book and support the author. Now let me start summarizing this book. Chapter 1. Weapons of Influence. The small jewelry store in Arizona was quiet for weeks. Master, a friend of mine. All hopes were pinned on the turquoise jewelry placed in the glass case. But tourists passing by are hardly hungry. She was sad and in despair wrote a note to leave for the staff. Everything in this glass case is half price. But instead of reading it as half, the clerk glanced at it and mistook it for a 2. As a result, the price of the entire shipment doubled. Something strange happened. The jewelry was sold out immediately. Not only did this incident surprise my friend, it also served as a perfect illustration of what I want to explain throughout this book. Because sometimes people don't react based on real value but on a superficial signal, a learned sign. In this case, high price becomes proof of quality. I call such signals click. Why? It clicks like a button being touched. Then the pre-recorded behavioral tape played smoothly. This is not just a human trait in the natural world. We see it everywhere. The mother turkey, for example, is one of the most famously devoted birds. But that devotion only needs a single signal to be activated. Chick chirps, as long as there is that sound. The mother hen immediately incubates, cares for, and protects the chicks. Losing the signal, even if the chicks are still alive, the mother hen may turn away or attack. A researcher named W. Fox conducted an experiment where he placed a stuffed ferret. It is a natural enemy of turkeys in the coop. Immediately the mother hen rushed forward, pecking fiercely. But when he placed a speaker inside the stuffed ferret that chirped, the result was completely reversed. The mother hen pulled the enemy close to her, carefully caring for it like a child. We can laugh at the naivety, but look at ourselves. How many times have we behaved like that mother turkey? Reacting according to a set script just because a familiar signal is turned on. These fixed behavioral bands, action patterns, are hidden deep within each person. And once the switch is turned on, we slide into a predetermined trajectory. There was an experiment at Harvard conducted by N. Lanzer. Clearly illustrates the operation of these scenarios. She wanted to borrow the photocopier when she simply said, "Excuse me, I have 5 pages, can I use the machine?" Only about 60% of people agree. But when she added a reason, "Because I was in a hurry," the percentage increased to 94%. What's remarkable is that even when the reason is nonsense, "Because I need a photocopy," the approval rate is still about the same. 93% of the word alone "because" was enough to make the why-a-click behavior tape give way. Whatever the reason behind it in a complex society, these psychological shortcuts help us survive. No one can stop to analyze every little choice of the day. If we had to consider all the data, we would be paralyzed. So we rely on simple principles. High price usually means quality. When the majority chooses it, it is definitely right. The man in the white coat is the expert most of the time. Those principles are true and they save us energy. But that's why they also become fatal weaknesses. As long as someone knows how to push the button, we will act like a machine. Remember the scene in the Knock Lamb store with customers who were not knowledgeable about gemstones. But they believe in the principle of expensive equals good, the only signal, the high price number is enough for them to rush to buy. And when they walk out of the store, they can be proud that they just made a wise decision, just like the swordfish in the wild. Pretend to be a cleaner fish to trick big fish, open its mouth and bite off a piece of meat. Salespeople and advertisers do the same thing. They don't need to use force, just pretend to dance properly, we voluntarily open our mouths. They just take their share. These are what I call weapons of influence. They are small, subtle, but when used properly can make people obediently follow without knowing they are being led. And what is more dangerous than that, even when we are influenced, we still firmly believe that we are free to choose. The advantage of these automatic rules is that they are often efficient, helping us respond quickly in a complex world. But that very movement opens up a dangerous gap. If someone knows how to set the scene, they don't need force or coercion to lead us to act as they wish. Look at the principle of contrast in perception. A simple experiment with 3 basins of water can demonstrate this. Dip one hand in cold water, one hand in hot water, then place both in the same basin of warm water. But the hand that was just cold feels hot, the hand that was just hot feels cold. Our perception is not absolute. It depends on the comparison point just before. Retailers have turned this into a tactic. In men's clothing stores, the staff always show the customer the expensive suit first before showing the sweater. Intuition suggests we should do the opposite because customers who have just spent a large amount of money will be reluctant to spend more. But they know that after spending $495 on a suit, that $95 sweater suddenly feels light. The customer not only bought the suit but also bought a shirt, tie, belt, and the total amount was much more than if they had bought them individually. If you do it the other way around, the results will be counterproductive. After looking at a cheap sweater, the suit became unacceptably huge, like the feeling of that basin of warm water. Customer perception is shaped by what comes before. The principle of contrast is not limited to the clothing industry, nor is it limited to real estate. I have observed brokers having bait houses. Those are run-down, overpriced properties. No one has any real intention of selling. They are provided for customer comparison only. After passing through a few of those awful houses, the house the company wanted to sell, which was only average, suddenly became extremely attractive. Customers see it as a bargain. Signed the contract with the confidence that I had found a gem in the car sales industry. This tactic is taken even further. The seller closes the car deal first and then adds on the extras. Radio, electric windows, rear view mirrors. Compared to the huge amount of money just spent on the car, every few $100s becomes a small number. The customer nodded repeatedly and the total bill increased significantly. It is important to understand that these techniques are not coercive. The buyer is not obliged to pay. It all looks voluntary and free. But in fact their very perception is framed by the contrast principle. The scene is arranged to make the next choice seem easy. I remember a story that went viral as a humorous example of a girl writing a letter to her parents, telling them that she had a traumatic brain injury, left her dormitory, fell in love with an older man, got pregnant, and was about to get married, but he had a criminal record and an STD. After putting all the shock on her parents, she confessed that she was really just failing American history and chemistry. In an instant, those bad scores became a small matter. It is the principle of contrast that turns what was originally a big problem into a light burden. These examples are just to point out a fact. Our emotions and judgments are always warped by context. We believe we see reality. But we are really just looking through the lens of what we have just experienced. What makes these weapons of influence dangerous is that they are virtually invisible. The user of them does not need to reveal the manipulating hand. They just need to put the right pieces in the right place. The rest is done by the automatic tapes within us. We believe we are choosing wisely. But in fact they are just following a pre-existing path, and just like jiu-jitsu uses the force of the opponent to knock them down, psychological exploiters do not use direct force, they only borrow force from the principle that is inherently useful to us. That's what makes it hard to detect. Because most of the time, those principles work in our favor. Only in cleverly staged situations do they become traps. Remember the story of Nok Lam jewelry store. Customers come in. Not knowing anything about gemstones, they carry with them a simple principle learned in life: expensive means good. That principle is often true and helps them make quick decisions among thousands of choices. But this time it made them willingly walk into the trap and even leave the store feeling satisfied. Similarly, many people cut out coupons without reading them carefully. Just seeing the colorful paper makes them think of saving immediately. There was a company that printed a coupon by mistake and didn't reduce the price, but customers still flocked to it. Coupon's appearance alone was enough to make the tape pop. Coupon by click: why a benefit and purchase decision is made. The biggest paradox lies there. It is these principles that often work to our advantage, making us less vigilant against exploitation. Most of the time expensive equals good is true. Thanks to that, we don't need to become experts in every field. Many people choose the degree that is definitely correct and is often correct. That way we don't have to test everything alone. White coat of authority is also often correct. This saves us the effort of researching complex problems ourselves. Because these principles often help us save effort and make rational decisions, we let them operate unconsciously. And that is the gap for others to exploit. I want you to imagine that when a salesperson skillfully sets the scene, he doesn't have to lie outright, nor does he have to force anything. He just lets you push your own buttons. Just like a jiu-jitsu practitioner only needs to redirect the opponent's force, a manipulator only needs to place the right signals, and the rest happens as programmed. You may think these tricks are just trivial things, but in fact their impact is not small. When several principles are combined together, they become a formidable force. Example of refusal technique. Then concessions, which I will analyze later. Works on both the principle of reciprocity and the principle of contrast. When someone makes a very large request and then reduces it to a smaller request, we both feel the need to reward the concession, and the smaller request becomes reasonable in relation to the original, the two principles working together. And the results often make us agree to things we would otherwise say no to. The power of weapons of influence lies not only in their effectiveness but also in their invisibility. Their users can exploit you without revealing any trace of their setup. It all looks like you made the decisions yourself, and that's why they're dangerous. Remember the principle of contrast. A bucket of water can be perceived as hot or cold depending only on previous experience. Similarly, an item, a request, a decision can become pleasant or unpleasant simply because of how it is placed in a comparative frame. You don't realize you're being led because the experience comes from your own feelings. That's why I see these principles as weapons that are not brute force, but extremely effective. They are not just psychological theories but tools that people out there use every day. From car salesmen, real estate brokers to advertisers, even politicians. Anyone who knows how to push the right buttons can make you take action. I tell this not only to explain how others can persuade you, but also to help you identify situations where you are vulnerable. You need to know when you hear that click in your head and are about to turn on the familiar Wyatt tape. Without realizing it, you will walk away feeling free. But in fact it is just repeating a pre-written script. How many times have you found yourself saying yes just because of a small detail, a setup? How many times have you been surprised to realize that your decision didn't seem entirely rational, but you still defend it because it feels like the natural choice? This is the starting point of the journey I want to take you through. I will dissect each fundamental principle, each weapon of influence that people exploit each other from reward, commitment and consistency, social proof, liking, authority to scarcity. Each principle will be explained with experiments, real-life situations, and demonstrations that show how powerfully they operate in everyday life. Before we dive into each principle, keep one thing in mind. These automatic behavioral tapes are both our salvation and our Achilles heel. They help us survive in a chaotic world, but also turn us into puppets if someone knows how to push the right buttons. Chapter 2. Reward. There is a rule that permeates every human society, so strong that it transcends cultural and religious boundaries. That is the rule of reciprocation. When someone gives us something, we feel compelled to give it back. No matter how big or small the gift is, no matter how symbolic it is. A simple invitation or help still creates in our hearts an obligation to respond. This is the fundamental principle for cooperation. Without it, social transactions will become much riskier as everyone fears being taken advantage of. That is why every culture engraves and teaches this principle. Not only is reciprocation encouraged, but failure to do so is also looked down upon. Every society has its own bad labels for the ungrateful, the swindler, the cheater, and the defaulter. Those words were so heavy that just hearing them made you want to avoid being tagged. The power of this rule lies not only in the fact that it motivates us to return a gift, but also in the fact that it can be exploited. Many cases show that just a small favor is enough to make us accept much larger requests later. Dennis Riggins' experiment illustrates this clearly. In the experiment, a collaborator sat with the participant to evaluate the paintings. During the break, Joe went out. Some people returned with a bottle of Coca-Cola to give to the subject. Others returned empty-handed. At the end of the day, Joe asked them to buy lottery tickets. Results showed that those who were given free gifts tried to buy twice as many tickets as the group that were not given anything. More remarkably, this reward effect is so strong that it erases even liking scores. People who don't like Joe still buy tickets just because they just received a small gift. This is important. The reciprocation principle can compel us to say yes even when the offer is not to our liking. A few cents worth of soda can lead to a pile of unnecessary lottery tickets. It is this same mechanism that explains the success of groups like Hare Krishna over the years. Their followers are seen at the airport on the street, handing out small gifts, usually a flower, a brochure, or a cheap magazine. Gifts are given without asking, sometimes even shoved into the hands of passers-by. Immediately after that, they asked for donations. Many people who have no interest in Krishna still give money. Many flowers were thrown in the trash a few steps later. But that doesn't diminish the power of the trick because the reciprocation rule has been triggered, the recipient feels indebted. And the quickest way to get rid of that feeling is to pay it back with some money. So the irony is that a gift may initially be unwanted, even annoying, but it still works, as long as it is perceived as a gift. The obligation to repay still arises. Today, the free sample format in supermarkets is also based on this principle. Consumers often think that the purpose of a sample is to let them experience the product, but the truth is, it is a strategy that exploits feelings of indebtedness. The sample recipient not only tastes the flavor but also carries an invisible debt. Many people have spent a lot of money to buy products just because they don't want to walk away empty-handed after receiving gifts. Amway also systematizes this principle with a technique called sucking. The salesperson brought to the customer's home a bag of products, washing powder, shampoo, detergent, and left it for 2 to 3 days completely unopened. Guests are encouraged to try it. When the staff returns, usually about half of the products have been opened and many orders have been signed. The customer may not need the product yet, but the trial has turned into an obligation to buy. The effect was so strong that the national Amway system made it a standard strategy. In all these examples, the common point is that a small act on the part of the giver creates a big obligation on the part of the receiver. And that obligation is often not based on real desire but just to escape the discomfort of feeling indebted. What makes the reciprocity rule a dangerous weapon is that it can be used to get things in return that are disproportionate. The recipient of a small favor often returns more than the original value. Just one inexpensive gift can bring the giver a large profit. Think about real-life situations. One day you accept a cup of coffee from a coworker and the next day you are willing to help them with a task that requires much more effort than the cup of coffee is worth. Or you receive a small card from a charity and then immediately reach into your wallet and donate a not insignificant amount of money in real-life experiments and observations. This repeats itself. A fundraising group included a letter of appeal with a small gift. Stamps, address labels, pocket calendars. The number of people responding and sending money increased dramatically compared to just receiving plain mail. That small gift is enough to trigger the feeling of being in debt, and the simplest way to pay off debt is to spend money. This principle is not only present in the exchange of goods but also appears in negotiations. A special form of it is the denial tactic. Then give in. The petitioner begins with a big request. Will almost certainly be rejected. Then he backed down to a smaller request. In the eyes of the listener, the small request suddenly becomes reasonable. Why? Because they feel the other side has given in and they need to repay by accepting. This technique also incorporates the principle of contrast. A large request that has just been refused makes the next request, which is not small at all, appear much easier. It is this combination of payoff and contrast that gives the tactic its tremendous power. I remember when I was researching historical cases there was one event that stood out. The break-in at the Democratic Party headquarters in the Watergate building, the incident that led to the downfall of President Nixon. To understand why such intelligent and experienced people would accept such a reckless, futile, and risky plan, it is necessary to review how it was proposed. Gandhi, who was notoriously reckless, initially proposed a huge, expensive, absurd plan, which was of course rejected. But when he came back with a lighter sentence for the Watergate break-in, it suddenly seemed reasonable in comparison. Because it was presented after a much larger request, those present felt it was a concession and they needed to respond with agreement. Denial effect. Concessions have also been tested in many other contexts. One study found that when people were invited to join a long-term program, they refused. But when the request was reduced to one time accompanying a child on a trip to the zoo, the agreement rate tripled. Once the large request is rejected, the smaller request seems acceptable, and participants agree not only because it is easier, but also because they feel obligated to reciprocate the concession. The rule of reciprocation also involves not only repaying favors in kind or in action, but also in making concessions in arguments or changing decisions. One may yield in political position simply because the opponent has made previous concessions in negotiations. This chain of actions often creates a spiral of back-and-forth concessions that leads to agreement. The danger, however, is that once someone uses the refusal-then-concession tactic skillfully, the other person may agree to something they don't really want. Then they even feel good about their decision because they find a reason to rationalize that it wasn't so bad. Studies show that after accepting a small request using this technique, participants are more likely to continue to cooperate in the future. More than when they are asked directly from the beginning. As if once they have entered into the obligation to repay, they continue to act to maintain consistency. The combination of the reward rule and other factors makes it an extremely powerful weapon of persuasion. With just a small favor or a cleverly crafted concession, people can be led further than they think. The rule of reciprocity is both the foundation for the smooth functioning of society and an easily exploited loophole. It allows us to trust each other. Because we know that if we help someone today, tomorrow they will help us back. There is no such rule. Exchange and cooperation would be much more fragile, but precisely because it is taught, inculcated, and strongly enforced in every culture. It becomes a powerful tool in the hands of those who want to manipulate. Look at religious, political, charitable or commercial organizations. Many strategies are built around an initial gift. It could be a flower from a Hishna, a free sample of cheesecake at the supermarket, an Amway product left in the house, or even a concession in a negotiation. Such a gift, once given, almost certainly creates a psychological obligation in the recipient. The receiver, in order to escape the feeling of debt, often returns more than the value received. Therefore, this rule is not only strong but also disproportionate. A bottle of soda leads to a lottery ticket purchase, a cheap book leads to a donation, a small sample leads to an order, and an initial concession can lead to the approval of a much larger plan. What makes the reciprocity principle a weapon of influence is not its fairness but its ability to make others act beyond their original intentions. Not only do we return the favor, we feel good about doing so. In many cases, the person who has just been manipulated justifies his or her actions. I wanted to help before. Actually, that's fine with me. Studies show that this effect is long-lasting. A person who has reciprocated a favor is then more likely to continue helping as if to maintain consistency. That is, just one initial gift can set off a chain of actions that range from fundraisers to door-to-door sales to international negotiations. The principle of reciprocity is present as an undercurrent that causes us to make quick and often correct decisions. But when exploited, it can make us say yes to requests we should otherwise say no to. You need to recognize when you are in that situation, when someone unexpectedly gives you a small gift. Ask yourself if they are sincere or are they setting a trap. When a negotiating party lowers their demands, remember that it may not be because they are being generous, but because they want you to feel obligated to reciprocate. Of course, no one can live apart from this principle. It is what creates social cohesion, cooperation in family, community, and nation. But understanding it helps you stay sane. Instead of acting reflexively, you might pause for a moment to consider whether you are repaying a favor or being taken advantage of. This is the first big lesson I want you to take with you. Gratitude is a noble thing. But the feeling of debt can turn into chains. Appreciate when others give. But don't let a soda, a flower, or a subtle concession lead you away from your true desires. Because as you've seen, the reciprocity principle is not only the glue that holds society together, it's also one of the most subtle and powerful weapons of influence. Chapter 3, Commitment and Consistency. One of the most powerful forces driving human behavior is the desire to behave consistently with what one has said or done. Once we make a commitment, no matter how small, we often find it necessary to continue living up to it. This urge is so strong that it can cause us to stick with a wrong decision. Just because we don't want to appear erratic, consistency gives us a sense of security in a chaotic world. In a world where information is overwhelming, a firm stance saves us the energy to think. In addition, in the eyes of society, consistent people are seen as trustworthy, intelligent, and steadfast. On the contrary, the fickle person is seen as a changeable person. So we often force ourselves to stick with our choice, even when it no longer suits us. A classic experiment shows the power of this. Friedman and Fraser knocked on doors of California homes, asking them to put up a big, ugly sign on their front lawns. When asked to write the slogan, "Drive safely," most of the respondents refused. But in another group, 2 weeks earlier they had agreed to post a polite, pro-road safety sign in their window. When this group was asked to put up a large board, more than 70% nodded. Just one small initial action is enough to pave the way for a consensus with a much larger request. This is the back-end technique that people call FO in the getting your foot in the door. Once you open the door, it's hard to close it again. A small commitment becomes a stepping stone to bigger commitments. Marketers, charities, and political groups all know this. They rarely ask for a large sum of money or an action that is too much. They start with a gentle request: sign a petition, wear a small badge, receive a flyer. Once people agree to do that small thing, the psychological door opens and they easily accept larger requests later in business. This trick comes in many forms. The car sales lottery is a classic example. The seller offered a low price. The customer agreed, feeling he had gotten a bargain. Then the staff reports that there are additional charges or that the original price was miscalculated. The total amount increases. But many customers still signed the contract. Why? Because in their mind, they have already committed to buying that car. They don't want to break their unspoken promise to themselves. And so accept the higher price. I have seen this trick applied everywhere, not only in the auto industry but in many other types of transactions. Once a person has made a decision, once they have committed to a choice, they will find a way to maintain it even when conditions have changed. Once you nod, you usually keep nodding. The impact of this principle is even more profound when the commitment is made public. A promise made in front of many people makes us feel we have to save face. If the commitment is written down, it is even more effective. Once the written word becomes evidence, it is very difficult for people to turn their backs. And if commitment comes from a voluntary choice, rather than being forced, it becomes all the more binding. That is why many advocacy groups, religious organizations, or multi-level marketing networks require members to write down their beliefs, make commitments, and publicly declare them to the community. Such actions tie personal identity to choice, making withdrawal an unacceptable turning point. It is important to remember that the power of consistency is not always a companion of reason, it often turns into its chains. People continue to defend a losing decision. Just to avoid admitting their mistakes, they cling to an outdated belief. Because I don't want to be seen as changing. They invest more in failed projects just because they invested before. These examples show that the urge to be consistent is one of the most powerful motivators and also one of the most dangerous traps. This principle becomes especially powerful when the initial commitment is demonstrated in action in a study. People who simply say they will volunteer have much lower actual participation rates than those who make that commitment in writing. A signature, a piece of paper, turned a vague promise into an obligation. And so, people tend to organize their actions to be consistent with what they have recorded. Public commitment increases power many times over. Once a person publicly declares a point of view or a decision, it is difficult for them to reverse course even if new evidence shows that the initial choice was wrong. Because now honor and image are attached to that decision. Religious movements, political movements, and even sales campaigns take full advantage of this. Many groups require new members to publicly share their beliefs, write a manifesto, or call on others to join. It is the publicity that makes it harder for those people to back down. Once personal identity is tied to a belief or decision, consistency becomes shackles. Another common technique is to make the subject feel that the decision is completely voluntary. Voluntariness makes commitment stronger because people like to think they are not being forced. Once they have made a choice in an active state, they will feel the need to defend that choice even if it brings disadvantages. Friedman and Fraser's experiment on traffic safety pointed out another interesting aspect. One small commitment can change the way people see themselves. People who agree to hang a small sign begin to think of themselves as people who care about traffic safety. And because they want to be consistent with that image, they agree to bigger demands later on. This mechanism explains why the FO in the technique is so effective. One small action not only opens the door to big action but also changes your perception of yourself. I did it. I mean, I am that kind of person. Because I am that kind of person, I have to continue to act the same way. The lottery game in sales also operates on this platform. When the customer agrees to the initial low price, they start to build an image of themselves as the buyer of that car. They think about the amenities, envision driving. Brag to your friends about finding a new car until the price goes up. Giving up means destroying the self-image they have just built to avoid conflict. They continue to buy even though conditions are no longer favorable. The danger is that the urge to be consistent can lead to irrational decisions. People may cling to failed projects simply because they have previously invested. They put more money and effort into the loss. Instead of stopping, they defend wrong political positions just to avoid being seen as changing. They hold on to a failed relationship because they don't want to admit that the initial choice was wrong. This principle is also exploited in many other techniques. In military recruitment or training, recruits are often asked to write a pledge and read the oath aloud. In sales, employees encourage customers to place orders in their own handwriting within organizations. Public commitments are always displayed to bind members to their roles. The more evidence of choice that is retained, the greater the pressure to be consistent, and it is this pressure that makes people susceptible to being led when they look closely. We see many social campaigns that take full advantage of this principle. In one study, women were first asked if they would be willing to answer a few short survey questions over the phone, and most agreed. A few days later, when the researchers returned, they asked permission to go to the home to conduct a longer and more intrusive survey. Women who had previously agreed to a phone survey were twice as likely to be allowed into their homes. Just one small commitment opens the door to the next bigger step. Another example shows the impact of public commitment. In one study, some players were asked to predict horse racing outcomes. Those who made their choice public soon became much more confident in their decision. Even though no new information has come out. Letting others hear it forced them to believe they were right in everyday life. You can see this everywhere. Once someone writes down a goal, it becomes easier for them to pursue it. Once someone makes a statement on social media, it's hard to back away because their personal image is attached to that statement. Publicity turns into invisible chains. In particular, voluntary commitments are much more powerful than coerced commitments when someone feels free to choose. They feel the need to defend that choice even more. Many organizations know this well, so they don't just give orders but skillfully guide you to speak, write, and assert yourself. Once you believe you've made a free decision, the pressure to be consistent with yourself grows, and authors Friedman and Fraser found that the initial commitment can cause people to change the way they see themselves. People who agree to hang a small sign about traffic safety begin to define themselves as people who care about that issue. And because they want to be consistent with their new self-image, they continue to agree to ever greater demands. The lottery game also clearly demonstrates. After agreeing to buy a car at a bargain price, the customer begins to convince himself that the car is a good choice. Imagine driving it, showing it off to your friends, and then when the salesperson tells you the actual price is higher, you still buy it. Because now it is not just a transaction but a matter of maintaining the self-image that has been built. It can be seen that the principle of commitment and consistency is a powerful force that compels us to maintain our chosen behavioral trajectory, but it also has a dark side. It causes us to invest more in failed projects, hold on to flawed views, or defend harmful decisions simply because we don't want to be seen as indecisive. Looking back clearly, this is both a strength and a pitfall of strength because it helps us maintain our goals, persevere with pitfall actions. Because it can turn into chains that lead us to the end of error. Understanding this mechanism is the first step to self-protection. You need to ask yourself if you are continuing because you really want to or just because you don't want to break the consistency you are investing more for a good reason or just because you have already committed. That is the lesson I want you to take with you. Consistency is a valuable virtue. But when it becomes a barrier that prevents you from changing, it becomes an invisible prison. Distinguish clearly between true steadfastness and the shackles of an old commitment. Chapter 4. Social Proof. One of the most common shortcuts people use to decide what is right or wrong, should or should not be done, is to look at other people. When the context is unclear, when things are ambiguous, we tend to believe that if many people are doing it, it must be the right thing. I call it social proof. The truth is that this rule often comes in handy. The world around us is complex and we cannot analyze every situation. Looking at how the majority behaves often leads us to rational choices. Save time and effort. However, like any other automatic mechanism, it can also become a weak point. Because if social proof is faked or distorted, we still react as if it were real. An obvious example is fake laughter in television shows. The laughs were added later and came from a machine, but made the audience laugh harder, longer, and think the script was funnier. Even when the joke is bad, fake laughter still does the job of leading. It's like a chirp to a mother turkey. A single signal is enough to trigger a response. We laugh not because the content is actually funny, but because of social proof, the laughter of others. Said it was time to laugh. This phenomenon is not new. Since the 19th century in France, there have been groups of professionals hired to go to theaters to clap, cheer, or laugh at the right places. They are called claque. During the performances, the thunderous applause from this group echoed throughout the audience, making the play a resounding success. Regardless of the actual quality, audiences believe in the staged social drama and they act accordingly. The power of social proof is especially great in ambiguous situations. When we don't know what to do, we look around for cues from others. The problem is if everyone did it at the same time there would be dead silence. Each person waited for the others to act, and since no one moved, everyone thought there was no urgency. A heartbreaking example is the Kitty Genovese case in New York. Young woman attacked and murdered near crowded residential area. Dozens of people heard the cry for help, a few saw the scene, but no one called the police, not because they were cruel, but because they looked at each other and saw no one reacted, so they thought the situation probably wasn't serious. This is reverse social proof. The passivity of the majority becomes a signal to the individual that he should remain still. Subsequent field studies reinforced this. When people witness an obvious emergency, such as an accident, blood, or unconscious person, the rate of help is very high, regardless of how many people are standing around. But when the situation is ambiguous, when it is unclear whether the victim really needs help or not, the more witnesses there are, the less likely anyone is to act. Collective immobility is read as a signal that nothing needs to be done. This feature is also ingrained in urban environments. The noisy, crowded modern city, with its strangers jostling each other, creates the perfect setting for a collective silence of three elements: ambiguity, mass, and strangeness. Combined, they undermine individual action. As a result, an accident in the middle of a busy city may get less help than an accident on a deserted country road. Social proof not only influences immediate action, but can also lead to more serious consequences as the press publicizes details of suicides, increasing the number of other suicides in the area. This phenomenon is called the war effect after the character in Git's novel. The pattern of subsequent suicides also mirrored the details of the reported case. If the initial victim is young, the number of youth suicides increases. If it is a traffic accident, the number of fatal accidents also increases. Those deaths are the product of social proof. A behavior that is made public becomes a signal to others that it is a viable option. Studies on the water effect show that people imitate not only everyday actions but also the most extreme ones. After each high-profile suicide is reported in the press, the statistics curve shows a sharp increase in suicides shortly thereafter. Not only that, the type of suicide or accident that occurred also bears strange similarities to the reported case. When the newspaper wrote about a young person taking his own life, in the following weeks, the number of youth suicides spiked when the newspaper reported the suicide by car. Fatal car accidents also increased, exceeding the average. Social proof operates like a script. One public death becomes a model for others. This explains why many medical and sociological experts have called for a restriction on publishing details of suicides in the press, not because of concealment of information, but because they understand that such information may inadvertently sow the seeds of further tragedies, for social proof has a pervasive power far beyond common sense. It turns an individual action into a community signal. That power is not only found in tragic situations. Advertisers understand it and take advantage of it every day. The words bestseller, most popular, or everyone uses are not meant to provide objective information, but to elicit social proof. Consumers see many other people buying it and conclude that it must be the right choice, even though they don't have time to check the quality. That number and statement serve to lead back to social phenomena. It is important to emphasize that social proof is most powerful when three conditions converge: uncertainty, majority, and similarity. When the situation is ambiguous, people do not know how to handle it. When there are many other people present, each person looks around to guess the signal, and when the others are similar to him in circumstances, age, or status. Increasing impact. This combination makes tragedies like the Kitty Genove's case not just individual apathy but collective psychological consequences. Every New Yorker that night heard the cry for help and looked around to see that the windows were still lit, but no one called the police. Collective passivity becomes social proof that nothing is urgent. The result was a murder that lasted several minutes in the middle of a crowded residential area without being stopped. Later field experiments shed further light on this phenomenon. When a person collapses on a deserted street, the chances of getting help are very high. But when the same scene occurs in a crowd, the chances of getting help decrease. Unless the situation is clearly urgent. In ambiguous situations, it could be that the other person is just drunk, or just resting. Social proof from the passivity of the majority makes individuals stand still. The characteristics of modern urban life, noisy, crowded, unfamiliar, are the ideal environment for this type of social proof. The ambiguity increases because of the chaotic sound. Crowding makes each individual just one of hundreds, and unfamiliarity reduces personal responsibility. These three factors combine to make it easy for critical situations to be overlooked. But even when it leads to tragic outcomes, there's no denying that social proof is a useful survival tool. It allows us to adapt quickly to the environment, learn from others and save effort. In most cases, it is safe to follow the crowd. That is what makes this principle enduring and irresistible. However, it's important to remember that like fake laughter or hired clappers, social proof can be a fake signal like a paid crowd cheering or an unverified bestseller that still triggers this mechanism in us. The mechanical nature of the reaction is a weakness that others can exploit. Psychologists have conducted numerous field studies to examine the mechanisms behind the Kitty Genove's case. They found that when a situation was clearly urgent, such as a person collapsing unconscious or bleeding, help rates were very high. Regardless of how many witnesses there are, when the situation is ambiguous and uncertain, the likelihood of help decreases sharply as the number of people present increases, the more people are standing around. Each person tends to look to others to decide what to do. If no one moves, that stillness becomes proof that no help is needed. Characteristic elements of modern urban life contribute to this effect. Noise makes danger signals easy to miss. Crowding dilutes personal responsibility. And the alienation between city dwellers makes individuals feel less connected to strangers in need of help. These three factors combine to create the ideal environment for collective passivity. Parallelistic ignorance. Collective ignorance is a clear illustration of how social proof can paralyze human response. Each individual relies on the silence of others to conclude that the situation is not serious. While everyone is actually thinking the same thing, the result is that no one takes action and the victim is left alone. The impact of social proof is not limited to individual events. The WER phenomenon shows that it can affect entire communities. One public suicide leads to a wave of other suicides and even fatal accidents of similar nature. This shows that people tend to look at the actions of others, even tragic ones, to determine their own choices. Statistics show that this increase is not accidental. It happens systematically, repeatedly in many countries and many contexts. When a celebrity or an incident is covered in detail by the press, the number of related deaths increases as a form of psychological contagion, which is social proof at the community level. This principle has two sides in most cases. It is a tool that helps us adapt quickly when entering a new environment. We look at others to learn how to dress, speak, and behave when we don't know how to behave. Following the crowd helps us fit in. But when social proof is faked or when the majority remains silent in the dark, we are easily misled. Remember the fake laughter on TV shows. It was just a fake signal, but it made the audience laugh. Remember the hired clappers in the theater, the clack groups from the last century, or the everyone buys it lines in modern advertising. All are ways of exploiting this mechanism. We act not because of objective truth but because of a sign that everyone else is doing it. So if there's one lesson to be learned, it's that social proof is a useful psychological shortcut but also one of the most dangerous weapons of influence. It makes us laugh when nothing is funny, stay silent when we should speak, and even choose death just because we have seen others do so. Understanding this principle helps us stay more alert when standing in a crowd or when facing a signal. Instead, Moran believes that the majority must be right. Ask yourself if the social proof you see is really a reflection of reality or just a laugh from the silent machine of pluralist ignorance or a made-up number to guide you. Chapter 5. The Principle of Liking. In the art of persuasion, there is a special thief who uses neither force nor threats. He just smiled, giving off a friendly vibe that made you like him. And as soon as you relax out of sympathy, you agree to the offer, sign the contract, take out your wallet and pay. That's why I call it the friendly thief. Seasoned lawyers understand this better than anyone when they step into the courtroom. Not only do they prepare sharp arguments, but they also seek to make the jury like their client. They know that once rapport is established, the rest is much easier. Sometimes getting the jury to like your client is more important than the evidence. So is the commercial world. One of the most successful sales machines ever invented was the Tupper War Party. At these parties, neighbors and friends are invited to an acquaintance's home. The host not only displays the products but also turns the space into an intimate meeting. Guests buy not only to have the products but also because they like the host. Wanting to support friends, TPW doubled and tripled the selling power by combining the principle of reciprocation, social proof and above all, personal goodwill. I remember sitting and observing one such party. Orders kept pouring in not because the products were presented so convincingly but because of the friendly atmosphere. Phrases like, "I can't refuse my best friend's invitation," rang out. And yes, sales at these events far exceed those at traditional stores. The question is what makes us like someone. There are many factors and each can be leveraged to guide the decision. First of all, physical appeal. People often attribute other positive qualities to beautiful people, such as being smarter, more talented, and more trustworthy. Studies in Canadian elections show that good-looking candidates receive more votes in the court system. Figures from Pennsylvania show that attractive defendants, even when convicted, are less likely to be sentenced to prison, while less attractive people are more likely to receive harsher sentences, with looks alone being enough to tip the scales of justice. Second, similarity. We like people who are like us in dress, opinions, background, even trivial interests. Many experiments show that when beggars dress exactly like passers-by, the success rate increases. Another study found that simply having commonalities in school or hometown significantly increased the likelihood of people signing a petition. Even small similarities increase sympathy. This explains why in sales or campaign strategies people always try to create similarities. A car salesman might tactfully mention that he used to live in the customer's neighborhood. An insurance agent might reveal that his or her child attends the same school as the other person's child. When we feel this person is like us, we are more likely to nod. The third factor is praise. Few are immune to flattery. Research shows that even when we know the person giving the compliment has an ulterior motive, we still feel more sympathetic. Even empty compliments work in sales meetings. Continuously praising customers for their appearance, taste, and choices not only creates a pleasant atmosphere, but also creates an implicit obligation to respond with a consensual action, and cannot ignore the element of contact and cooperation. The more often we are exposed, the more familiar we become, and familiarity often leads to liking. However, this is only true when the associated experience is positive. If every encounter is accompanied by competition and conflict, contact only increases antipathy in education. The following composite layer model is extracted. Where students are forced to cooperate to complete tasks, attitudes between groups improve significantly. When we work together toward a common goal, sympathy arises, the very mechanism exploited in the good cop, bad cop technique. When one police officer is harsh and aggressive, and the other is gentle, understanding, and cooperative, the suspect feels the second officer is an ally. The illusion of cooperation makes him more likely to reveal information. Another subtle yet powerful element is association. Our affections can be transferred for only two reasons. Two things happened at the same time. Psychologist Gregory Jazrin demonstrated this with an experiment called the Lewin-John Tyke. He invited the subjects to lunch, and while they ate, he presented political messages. Results showed that messages associated with a pleasant meal experience were rated significantly more positively. Good food adds flavor to even the most difficult ideas. This principle of association is not limited to the laboratory, in life we see it everywhere. Brands associate products with celebrities with attractive images, with fun moments. A thirst-quenching drink advertised with youthful laughter. Sunny beaches. That fondness for the image seeps into how we feel about the product. This principle also explains the familiar behavior of sports fans when their team wins. Fans often say we win, wear the flag, show public pride, they want to share the glory. But when the team loses, the language changes to they lose and the public expressions disappear. Fans avoid being associated with failure but want to be associated with victory. It is evidence that we seek to associate ourselves with what feels positive and distance ourselves from what feels negative. All these factors, appearance, similarity, compliments, exposure, and associative cooperation create an invisible power. They make us like someone, and once we like them, we say yes to their offers much more easily. The danger is that we often fail to see the connection. We believe we agree because the offer is reasonable, but in reality our decision is warped by our emotions toward the offerer. Let's look at the Topper example again. Customers don't just buy plastic boxes, they buy them because they like the host, because they want to maintain a friendship, because they don't want to refuse in front of everyone. Personal feelings become the main driving force for purchasing action. And the company behind it, even in its absence, still benefits from the power of this principle. The impact of physical appearance is perhaps the most obvious example. Research shows that attractive defendants are less likely to be convicted and, if convicted, receive lighter sentences. Meanwhile, less attractive people are more likely to be convicted and given heavier sentences. Appearance alone is enough to change the outcome of electoral justice. Good-looking candidates get more votes, regardless of real ability. This is an example of halo bias. We attribute more positive qualities to what is beautiful. Similarities can be equally deceiving. An insurance salesman knows how to find little things in common: same school, same favorite football team, same hometown. These similarities, even if it has nothing to do with the product, it's enough to increase the approval rate. Because when we see someone like us, we trust them more, like them more, and therefore easily nod to suggestions. Compliments, even if fake, still have an effect. We like people who compliment us, even if we question their motives. In one study, people who received compliments had more positive attitudes toward the complimenter, even when they knew the compliment was insincere. Because comfort ultimately trumps doubt, contact and cooperation also operate on this mechanism. When we are familiar with someone, we are more likely to like them, as long as the experience is positive. If the relationship is set in a fiercely competitive environment, repeated exposure only reinforces the hatred. But if placed in an environment where cooperation is required to achieve a goal. As in the Chickasaw classroom model, the results were quite the opposite. Students of different skin colors and backgrounds began to like each other, cooperating to turn strangers into teammates. This principle is exploited in interrogation rooms. One police officer acts rough and forceful, the other is soft-spoken, sympathetic, offers water, says he just wants to help the stressed suspect, sees the second police officer as an ally, and so the confession is revealed. This is a form of fake alliance designed to create goodwill. The mechanism of association operates quietly but persistently in advertising. People associate products with pleasant surroundings, smiles, music, sunshine, and youthful images. The love for the setting permeates the product. That's why companies spend millions of dollars to associate their brand with famous faces, not because the celebrities understand the product, but because the admiration for them will spread to the product. Another study found that when a political message was presented while listeners were enjoying a delicious meal, their attitudes were significantly more positive than when they heard the same message in a neutral context. Good food doesn't change the value of an argument, but it does change how one feels. This explains why campaign parties or product launch events often include food. Pleasant experiences create a blanket of goodwill around the message in sports. This phenomenon is clearly observed when the team wins. Fans wearing T-shirts with logos chanted "We win" when the team lost. The language translates to "they lost" and the flag shirt disappeared. It is an unconscious choice to maintain our self-image, wanting to associate ourselves with glory and distance ourselves from failure. The study also found that after school team victories, students wore more school-branded shirts. Public pride is a way of bathing in the light of success. All of these elements combine to create one of the most powerful weapons of persuasion. Favorite. When we like someone, it is hard to refuse them. I nodded easily. Even when the offer is not in our favor, the danger is that we are rarely aware of this. We think we agree for rational reasons, but in reality the decision is warped by emotion. Therefore, a self-defense mechanism is needed. When we find ourselves leaning towards an offer, we should stop to ask ourselves whether we are agreeing because of the real value of the offer or just out of sympathy for the person making it. When a salesperson tries to create an overt similarity, realize it's a technique, not a coincidence. When compliments come pouring in, remember that they can be just tools. When products are placed next to attractive images, separate emotion from reality. If we are not alert, we will be led by friendly thieves. He never comes with a dagger but with a smile. He doesn't take anything from your pocket but makes you give it up willingly. And when you look back, you may realize that the reason you made the decision wasn't because of the product or service itself, but because you liked the person who offered it so much. The power of love. Ultimately, it is both a bridge to humanity and a trap. It helps us bond, cooperate, create trust and companionship, but it can also be exploited, causing us to make wrong decisions. Understanding this principle helps us enjoy the positive side of connection without falling into the trap of the friendly thief. Chapter 6. Principle of Authority. There is an invisible force that governs people so deeply that we ourselves often underestimate the power of authority. We grow up in systems where obedience to authority is necessary for society to function smoothly in most situations. Listening to teachers, doctors, officers, or officials helps us to act effectively and safely. But that very useful mechanism can also turn into a dangerous trap when exploited outside of its proper context. Many people believe that they are immune to the influence of authority, that they are independent enough to resist, but the evidence suggests otherwise. Stanley Milgram's famous experiment exposed a truth that shocked the entire academic world. Milgram recruits ordinary people, not soldiers, not tyrants, but everyday working citizens. They were told to participate in a study on learning and memory. In the lab, they sit in front of a control panel. There are switches that deliver electric shocks with increasing intensity. They were instructed that every time the learner answered incorrectly, they had to press a shock button, and each time the voltage increased. Before the experiment began, Milgram asked several experts to predict the outcome. Almost all believe that only a small 1%, about 1 to 2%, will go to the maximum shock level because no one would continue to torture another person when the victim is screaming. He pleaded that he had heart disease, but the actual results shocked the world. 65% of participants pressed the button all the way to the maximum 450 V, despite the victim's painful screams and eventual silence. What kept them sitting there, continuing to shock when their conscience urged them to stop? The answer lies in the supervisor's white coat and calm voice. He used no force or threats. He just said the experiment required him to continue. Duty to authority is enough to drown out the inner voice. The Milgram experiment shows that people can do things they never thought of simply because an authoritative person told them it was the right thing to do and when asked. Many people still justify that the responsibility does not lie with them but with the person giving the order. This obedience does not only occur in the laboratory, it happens every day on the streets, in hospitals, in offices. And the scary thing is that we often don't realize we're obeying just because of the outward symbols of authority. Look at Leonard Bigman's research. He dressed his associates in 3 styles: casual wear, formal suits, and security uniforms. This person stands on the street asking passers-by to do small things like give 10 cents to a stranger or pick up a bag for someone else. Results showed when wearing uniform. Compliance rate is twice as high as when wearing normal clothes. The clothes alone were enough to make the stranger obey. Another study found that when a man dressed in a business suit crossed the street at a red light, 3 times as many people followed him as when he was dressed in casual clothes. Clothing not only covers the body but also carries a signal of power. Even a car can become a symbol of authority in an experiment. When a luxury car stops at a green light, the car behind it waits longer before honking or doesn't honk at all. Compared to when it was an old car. Even if one did not know the person sitting in the car, its appearance was enough to create humility. Criminals understand this well and have taken advantage of it many times. There are scams where someone impersonates a bank employee or a security guard in uniform. Confidently order customers to hand over money or property. Victims obey not because they are threatened but because they believe in the authority of the uniform. If the clothes can make people obey, the title is even more powerful. Just the word "doctor" before a name can change the way the words are received. Studies show that when someone is introduced by a high academic title or degree, listeners automatically attribute more intelligence and prestige to them. And that effect can be dangerous when we don't verify the substance. An alarming example comes from the medical environment. In a study spanning multiple hospitals, nurses received calls from an unfamiliar doctor ordering injections of a drug called estrogen for patients. This medicine is not approved for use. The required dosage exceeded the safety limit, and the procedure also required in-person confirmation rather than over the phone. That means the order is wrong in many ways. Yet of the 22 nurses who participated, 21 were prepared to follow suit, only to be stopped by the researcher who stopped the power of the doctor title from overriding professional knowledge, professional experience, and safety procedures. This doesn't just happen in hospitals, in public places. When someone is introduced as an expert, their opinion is more accepted. Even when the content is identical to the opinion of an average person, body size, a clear voice, or a confident demeanor are implicitly associated with power by humans. A tall man is likely to be considered a leader simply because of his height in platform shoes. Wear a suit or pose imposingly to exploit that bias. The problem lies in everyday life. We often act as if these outward signs are sufficient proof of our true credibility. A uniform, a title, a luxury car, a tall figure. All of them can make us obey even when the request is unreasonable. If we go back to the MRAM experiment, the danger becomes clearer. Many participants said that they were not responsible, that it was the scientists who were responsible. They see themselves as mere tools, just following orders. This shift in responsibility allows people to harm others without feeling guilty. Another subtle mechanism of authoritative power is how it is reinforced by the environment. In Milgram's laboratory, the scientific setting, the solemn machines, the white coats, all created an atmosphere of authority. There was no need to shout or force, just the presence of authority was enough to motivate behavior. That is why, when we see a person crossing the street illegally but dressed politely, we easily assume that he has a reason to see a person in uniform asking him to do something. We rarely stop to ask questions. This saves time and energy because in most cases it is rational to obey authority, but that rationality can also be abused. Studies show that this level of conformity is even stronger than personal belief itself. In the estrogen drug experiment, the nurses knew the order was wrong but prepared to follow it anyway. It's not that they don't have the knowledge, but the weight of the title of doctor paralyzes them. In many fields, the combination of appearance, title, and environment creates a closed circle of authority that is enough to make people blindly obey. To protect yourself against this power, a principle of defense is needed, asking two questions. First, is this person truly an expert in the relevant field? An actor who played a doctor on TV does not become a medical expert in a coffee commercial. A celebrity on stage does not automatically become a good financier. It is necessary to separate real reputation from external symbolism. Second, is this person trustworthy? Many experts are articulate but self-serving. One of the signs of true credibility is when they are willing to admit a small disadvantage in their argument before emphasizing the big advantage. What salesperson would dare say their product has limitations and then give reasons why it is still a good choice? Often creates more real trust than someone who only praises the positive. The power of authority lies not only in its ability to control behavior but also in its stealth. A person who obeys often does not think he is being forced. They feel like they are doing the natural, logical thing. It is this false rationality that is dangerous. In the Milgram experiment, many participants walked out of the room relieved that the responsibility was not theirs. They tell themselves that it is the scientists who are responsible. This division causes them to continue to act against their conscience. And when asked, many people still believe they are just doing their duty. This is a clear demonstration of how authority can redefine the sense of personal responsibility. Outside the laboratory, that power is also present everywhere. A security guard uniform gives strangers the right to command the streets. A doctor's title over the phone is enough to make a nurse prepare the wrong injection. A luxury car makes the people behind wait longer. A tall figure enough to evoke leadership confidence in every situation. People respond to authority signals rather than substantive content. Such obedience is often quick, mechanical, and thoughtless, like a pre-recorded psychological tape. As soon as we hear the click of the authority signal, we spring into action. It saves effort but at the same time opens the door to manipulation in advertising. This is publicly available. An actor who has played a doctor on television can appear in a drug or coffee commercial and many viewers will still be convinced. Familiarity with the image of the doctor makes them naturally trust. Forget that this is just an actor. The power is borrowed from the role but the impact on the viewer is very real. This reminds us of the fundamental lesson. Not all jurisdictions are valid. It is necessary to distinguish between proper authority and false authority. A person can be good in one field but have no knowledge in another field. An impressive title. A formal outfit is no substitute for real expertise. Therefore, the most important principle of defense is to stop and ask whether this person is really the relevant expert and whether they can be trusted. If the answer to either is no, then their advice or command is not worth following. The power of authority is both necessary and dangerous. Society cannot function without it. But individuals can easily be swept away if they do not know how to control themselves. Understanding this principle helps us maintain balance, respecting real authority, but not being blinded by the outward symbols of a white coat, a neat suit, or a strong voice. Remember that these things can trigger an automatic response in you. That reaction once caused normal people in the Milgram experiment to do things they didn't believe they would do. That reaction once caused a nurse to prepare to inject a dangerous drug just because of a voice over the phone. That reaction once left the crowd standing still while an imposter collected money right before their eyes. If you want to escape manipulation, keep two simple questions in mind. Is this real authority? And are they trustworthy? Just stop to wonder. You have regained some freedom from the invisible hand of authority. Chapter 7. The Principle of Scarcity. People don't just buy a plastic box or a vacuum cleaner, they buy the feeling of losing it. I've been seeing the same trick over and over again just today. Limited quantity, I can't go back again. What is remarkable is not the words but their effect on our minds. As soon as the opportunity is narrowed, we feel the need to make a decision immediately. Time is locked, quantity is locked and reason is locked. Originally wanted to ask for one more night to think but got locked up again. When an opportunity is limited, it is better to take a rare shortcut. In most contexts, this shortcut is not silly. Scarce things are expensive to make and difficult to obtain. But that shortcut has a deeper thread. When our freedom of choice is threatened, we react. It is a psychological reaction against loss of freedom. The more one feels deprived of the right to decide, the more one wants to assert that decision. Even if the object isn't necessarily worth that much. Because of this, deadlines have become a favorite lever in home vacuum cleaner demonstrations. The seller emphasizes that today is the only chance to get this price. In baby photography studios, model photos are said to be destroyed very early in membership packages. Offer valid until end of date and company policy does not allow extension. The goal is not in the number itself, but in taking away your thinking space. There is another type of scarcity, less obvious but often more compelling. Scarcity of information when customers believe they have just heard a limiting story, such as an impending supply shortage, they change their behavior much more quickly. And when that news is presented as inside, exclusive information, the effect is even stronger, scarcity piled on scarcity, with both less goods and less people knowing. Just like that, orders skyrocketed not because of a sudden change in quality but because of a now or never feeling. Scarcity also makes things that are blocked attractive. I recall the jury studies in Chicago. When a judge asks jurors not to consider a piece of information, they do not dismiss it from their minds. On the contrary, information that is forbidden to be considered influences their compensation decisions more strongly than information that is told not to be considered. The brain reacts as if freedom is being violated, and so we want to do it more. There is a simple yet incisive experiment about how we judge the value of a cookie jar of the same type. When the jar was full of 10 cakes, the taster gave it a moderate score, but when there were only 2 cakes left in the jar, the cakes suddenly tasted better and were worth more money. What's most interesting is that since these cookies weren't originally scarce, but had just been taken from a full jar, the loss increased the value even more than the scarcity that was already available. The brain not only weighs what it has, but is also sensitive to the slide from having a lot to having little. This hit-and-miss model isn't just for cookies. Social history has repeatedly shown that when a period of improvement is abruptly reversed, the collective reaction is much stronger than in places that were deprived to begin with. People are sensitive to trends. With the momentum of going up or down, what is taken away in the middle makes us fight back more fiercely than what was never there. Scarcity touches the most sensitive nerves in adolescence. The more forbidden, the more children want to touch the forbidden thing. Couples who are opposed to each other often love each other more intensely. Interference turns feelings into something worth protecting. Smart advertising campaigns understand this. They tie the message to the idea of freedom. So that every time we see a prohibition, we find ourselves on the side of the right to choose. There is another variation that makes scarcity heat up competition. Nothing heightens desire like seeing other people pouncing on the same item. Therefore, a good used car salesman will schedule a car viewing at the same time. When 2 or 3 buyers walk around a car in an afternoon, the feeling of having to make a decision immediately arose clearly. The question is whether I really need it. Overshadowed by the question of whether others will take it, use value declines. Property values soar. All those colors lead to the same center. Scarcity increases desire, shortens thinking, and gives us the illusion that rare equals good. Sometimes that's true. Some things are rare because they are difficult to make, or because they are of high quality. But many other times the scarcity is just the set, a stage effect, a countdown clock, a sign with 2 remaining reels, a photo about to be destroyed. All of these are switches that click and we fall into a hasty decision as if it were the inevitable choice. So what to do when you hear that click of a switch in your head? First ask yourself, does the scarcity attribute have anything to do with quality or your real need? If it's full again tomorrow, I still want it like this. If no one is available, I will slow down to read the terms carefully. Then comes the second question, is this scarcity just lost or inherently scarce? If it's a sudden pullback, be doubly careful because the pullback itself is inflating your cravings. Not all forms of scarcity have the same impact. When an opportunity is inherently rare, it quietly arouses desire. But when an opportunity is just within reach and then withdrawn, the fire flares up, and we react more strongly to this decline than to its innate rarity. So those early bird or pre-order sale announcements that someone else has snatched up often make hearts race faster than any extremely rare item offers. There is another lever, less noisy but sharp. How to frame the message when people hear that if they don't act they will lose something. The effect is much stronger than hearing that if they act they will get extra. Sales practice confirms this time and time again with the same offer. The don't miss version gets people off their seats faster than the take more version. On the psychological scale, the loss weighs more than the gain. When scarcity is coupled with exclusivity of information, the impact increases exponentially. A commercial experiment showed that simply warning of impending supply shortages caused orders to spike compared to a control group. But when the news of the scarcity was said to have come from a private, little-known inside source, the order volume increased even more. Urgency due to lack of goods breeds privilege due to lack of knowledge. And we have the feeling of standing before a door that is only open for a few moments. When freedom is clearly threatened, the reaction of resistance springs up instinctively. That is why the command not to take this information into account can be counterproductive. Mock trials in Chicago showed that when judges asked jurors to ignore the fact that a defendant had insurance, the award did not decrease, it tended to increase. It's as if the no-thinking sign pushes the brain into thinking assertion mode. You can see the same rule in the family: the more you forbid, the more the child wants to touch the forbidden thing, the more the prevented love burns fiercely. Not for any lofty romantic reasons, but for the instinct to claim self-determination. Scarcity is even hotter when there is a competitor standing right next to it. If an opportunity is rare, we can still take it easy. But if you see someone else reaching out, the feeling of possession turns into a race. Therefore, experienced sellers often arrange for multiple customers to view at the same time. They need say no more. 3 eyes meeting on the same item was enough to do the convincing. Here we are not only fighting against the countdown clock but also against people. However, it is necessary to keep a background question for yourself. Does scarcity have anything to do with the nature of the thing in question? The cookie in the jar with 2 cookies left was judged more attractive than the cookie in the jar that was full, but the deliciousness did not increase, only the perceived value increased elsewhere. A photo about to be destroyed becomes more worth buying. But the photo quality remains the same. Scarcity doesn't make something taste better, run better, or better suit your needs. It just makes you want it more. The rule is there: if lost, there is a social version. When a community that has gone through a period of improvement suddenly declines, discontent flares up more strongly than where it was deprived to begin with. The sudden withdrawal of sensation creates a reactive dynamic. The cookie jar analogy isn't just a metaphor, it's how the brain maps the path of the curve rather than just looking at the absolute value. Go further and you will find that the old campaigns that smell like freedom are actually inviting an anti-freedom reaction in you. When the message associates the product with the image of choice, it turns every adversary into a common enemy. Thus, seemingly benign slogans can lead to powerful changes in behavior. We smoke more, buy more, go deeper. Not because of the utility but because of the feeling that I am regaining a piece of freedom. If you chain it together, you will see 3 spikes often appearing together, used as a weapon in times of scarcity. A deadline closes the door of time. A private message seems to be for the few and a little competition is enough to see others want it too. When all 3 are present, few people can resist the urge to make an immediate decision. That's when it's time to do a quick mental test, asking yourself if you're chasing the product or running away from the fear of missing out if you let go of the sign for today. Or if there is no other competition, does its attractiveness remain the same? If that inside information is withdrawn, what reason remains to justify the decision? Just by answering these questions, you've already taken away a lot of the scarce fuel that's used to burn you. Because scarcity itself is just a framework. Some days the frame holds the painting in place, and some days it obscures the painting. Your job is to pull it aside long enough to see if the thing in the middle of the frame is actually worth bringing home. Scarcity creates 2 parallel incentives. It inflates desire and stifles reason in self-defense. I learned to recognize its familiar trigger signals. First is the time limit slogan. Countdown timer for today only. Second is limited quantity, last 2 slots left. Third is the exclusivity of inside information, known only to a few. And finally, direct competition arranges so that you see someone else reaching for the same tray. When these signals appear, the thing to do is not to immediately tense up against them, but to separate the 2 types of values. One is use value. Does it help me solve the problem? Is it suitable for your needs? Is there a better alternative? Second is the value of possession. What is the feeling of pleasure before the door closes? Scarcity only affects the second part. If after asking the question you find yourself pulled away more by the feeling of loss than by the utility, step back. I also remind myself of the difference between less from the beginning and just being reduced in the cookie jar. The greatest increase in attraction was not in the jar that originally had only 2, but in the jar that had just been reduced from 10 to 2. We react to downward slopes. Not only with the low mark, that rule governs many hasty decisions in real life. Tickets just sold out, someone else has just closed the deal. Offer just withdrawn due to increased demand. When I heard those phrases, I knew I was standing on the edge of my brain. What alarms me most is the information that is suppressed in jury simulations. As soon as the judge says not to take this detail into account, that detail suddenly weighs more heavily in the minds of the decision-makers. The reaction against loss of freedom is not an abstract theory. It is a nervous habit. So the strategies that make the news seem limited, or just leaking to a small group, almost always results in a faster closing. Besides, that is the effect of the language frame. A message: if you don't act you will lose. Create more traction than a message if the action you take will be on a visceral level. The loss resonates deeper than the lyrics. Sales campaigns understand this and patiently hone their wording to get the right shot. I can't disable that reflex, but I can shift it to asking whether I'm losing something truly important or just a fleeting sense of privilege. Competition is the final piece that often falls into place at just the right time. When many people look at the same goal, what I see is no longer a product but a race. That is why a seasoned seller will schedule multiple viewings at the same time. They don't need to preach about features, just let 3 eyes meet on the hood is enough. In that moment, we stopped reading the contract. We read our opponent's movements. And that's when the ugly terms crept in. Everything here works because scarcity often holds true in the real world. Many things are rare because they are difficult to make, many opportunities are rare because they are really few. This principle helps us choose quickly when there is not enough data. But when it's staged, we need a little ritual to slow it down. Take a breath, look away from the countdown, and re-examine the 3 value points using independent evidence and the path of information. If those 3 points hold, sign. If one of the 3 is held by few known, or someone else is taking it, leave the decision overnight. I also noticed a subtle variation. Scarcity is associated with freedom. When a sales message connects a product to a feeling I choose, every objection becomes an object to resist. From then on, people no longer protect the goods, they protect the free ego. And this explains why some campaigns with a liberating flavor can fuel unhealthy behaviors. Scarcity doesn't just sell stuff. It sells a story about the person we want to become. Of course, no one can live without rare shortcuts. The problem is not to remove it but to put it in the right place. Use it when we lack information but the risk is low, and turn it off when signing something binding. One pleasant paradox of modern life is to retain freedom of choice. Sometimes you have to practice speaking so that you can decide tomorrow while the clock is counting down. So when I saw the line that said 2 spots left, I didn't look at the number. I look at what it's doing to my heart rate and my thought rate. If I still want the item tomorrow, when the doors are wide open and the crowd has left, that's the right sign to go ahead. And if desire fades with the last chimes of the clock, I know I've just escaped a clever click of the scarcity principle. Thank you for choosing attention, the scarcest resource of our time, to walk with me through this whole journey. If the book has any value, it is that it gives us a language to name the small clicks that are enough to bring about a whole new level of success in our daily decisions. Once we have language, we have concepts. With concept, we have autonomy. I want to close with a simple note. The principles you just heard reward commitment and consistency. Social proof, likability, authority. Scarcity is not magic or an innate lever of manipulation. They are heuristic rules that society develops to reduce cognitive costs. Because they are often true, they are useful. Because they are often true, they are easily abused. The paradox here is that the more streamlined the rules, the more convenient they are for the mischievous. So the ethics of influence lies not in the principle itself but in how we put the principle into context. If I had to distill the book down to a single defensive habit, I would choose the discipline of taking a break when receiving unwanted gifts. Take a moment to allow yourself to say no without feeling guilty. When about to sign a public commitment, pause to ask yourself if you are defending your ego more consistently than defending the truth. When you see a crowd laughing, clapping or standing still, take a beat to separate the offerer from the value of the offer itself. When faced with a white coat or a flashy title, pause to ask two classic questions. Does this person have the appropriate authority? And are they trustworthy when the countdown clock ticks, pausing to distinguish the pleasure of possession from its utility value? That brief pause is the thin line between automaticity and freedom. I know the tenacity of quick decision-making is not easy to change. We live in an environment that forces us to react. But that's why all progress on the personal and community level starts with small adjustments. A timely question, a different way of putting it, a polite but firm refusal. Sometimes resistance doesn't take the form of a fight, it's just a habit of going back and checking the context before pushing the button. Thank you for your patience to get to the last page. If what you heard has helped you see the world even a little clearer, I consider it an honor. If you find the book worthy, please leave a short review or a few lines of comment. Not because of the fake stars but because your reviews are a form of social proof that I hope to use with integrity. Help later comers gauge whether or not to invest their attention. Be upfront about what's helpful, what you disagree with, and what's missing. A good review enriches a work more than all the praise. And because the reading journey is always longer than any single book, I would love to hear your next suggestion. What piece are you looking forward to? Any topic you want covered with the same rigorous standards, faithful to sources, tight in argument, and economical in criticism. Suggest a book title, an author, even an issue so we can open a new dialogue. I will read, listen, and if I am fortunate enough, retell it in a way that does justice to the text and respects your intelligence. Thank you and see you again.